And I'm going to start the webinar. So good luck, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much to those of you that are joining us today for this webinar session. I'm just looking at the fact that people are still busy logging on. We are actually waiting for one of our speakers, and hopefully he'll be able to join us very shortly by being able to log on. So welcome to those of you who are coming, and this is our third, I think, webinar this year, and we are still following a theme around human rights and environmental due diligence. And this particular webinar, we are focusing on sport, which we're really excited to be doing today. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Colleen Theron. I am the CEO of RDA International and founder of RDA International. Tell you a little bit more about it in a moment, but I'm really delighted to be joined by the speakers today. So Andrea Florence, who is the Acting Director of Sports and Rights Alliance, and Daniela Hirt from the Center for Sport and Human Rights. And we're really hoping that Mustafa is going to be able to join us shortly for his part of today's webinar. And thank you to Andrea and Daniela for giving up your time and coming to share your insights today. I think we're going to have a really fruitful discussion, and I'm looking forward to questions and answers around our topic today. For those of you that are just joining now, if we are going to have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the speakers' presentations. Please do use the question and answer or chat function. We will try and address all your questions during this session. We will have a recording available of the webinar, which will go up onto our website in the next few days. So just really kicking off today, as I said, we are hoping that Mustafa will be joining us shortly. And we are welcoming Daniela and Andrea for today's session to speak with us. So just a very, very short introduction from my side, a little bit about RDA and our work. And then I wanted to just set the scene a bit around human rights due diligence, some of the changes in the laws that we are seeing and trends to help, I think, bring a slightly different viewpoint to human rights due diligence for the audience. So as a business with RDA, we work internationally and across a range of sectors. We are actually working with some of the Premier League football clubs in supporting them around their policies and training and due diligence procedures. And actually, we've launched a new academy called the RDA Academy, which we are hoping to encourage more organizations to join, honing in specifically around business and human rights issues. As a business, we are specialists in business and human rights sustainability, and we have particular expertise around modern slavery. I'm really honored that RDA was shortlisted for the Thomson Reuters Stop Slavery Award this year, which was a real honor for us. So we've been privileged, Rory and one of my consultants, and were asked by Daniela and her team to contribute to a book, which she's going to be telling you more about. And we've looked particularly at human rights due diligence. And I thought I would share just a few points around these issues for today, and really just, I think, highlight why, we think that sport as a sector has really not had as much focus on it around business and human rights issues as some other sectors, but we see an increase in that. And I think for me, working with organizations, clubs, governance bodies, that recognition that actually sport and in itself is also or should also be part of the same scrutiny as other organizations is really critical. Yay, I'm so glad to see Mustafa's managed to get on. Welcome, Mustafa. just doing an intro, and I'll hand over to you just now. So I think for a number of you who are listening today, you will have heard me speak a few times about driving changes to why we're seeing this increased requirement for transparency and accountability for organizations and business, and how they manage their human rights impacts. And there's just a few that I've highlighted on the on my slides. I think what I really want to draw out are things like climate change and environmental issues are inextricably linked today to human rights issues, and we're seeing that the two cannot really be divorced. We see how the laws are beginning to draw these things together, and I think for the sports sector, along with any other sector, really having to hone in on what due diligence means for both environmental and human rights side is going to be critical. And I think in the next 5 years, we'll see the linking of these two things in a much bigger way. I also wanted to actually highlight in the slide, not just things around the UN guiding principles and obviously the changes in social media and transparency, but actually just to pull out the fact that the national contact points, which are set up by the OECD to hear complaints for breaches of guidelines to the OECD, are playing an increasing role in addressing breaches by sports governing bodies. And I think that sometimes we don't see as much of the effects of the decisions under the national contact points to creating change in the media than perhaps we should see when you actually scrutinize how, for example, FIFA's had to react to decisions by the national contact points around a number of issues concerning human rights. And I'm sure that they had a seminal or they were seminal in why things were addressed or are being addressed by FIFA. So just very quickly, I want to leave as much time as possible to the other speakers to come in. This is just a snapshot on the growth and the changes to law. All I want to emphasize here is that there is an increasing requirement, and this will cover sports organizations with certain thresholds in turnover and number of employees to ensure that they have appropriate due diligence in place. And in relation to the book where we were, and some of the case studies that we've pulled out around human rights due diligence and mega sporting events, we do just talk about the OECD requirement of what characterizes good due diligence. And in fact, the way that we drafted our chapter very much follows the framework that is set by the OECD. And I think perhaps what you would be interested in today is under each of those features, we've looked at what are some of the examples that are being set by international governing bodies like the IOC, like FIFA, and pulling out where we've seen particular weaknesses or areas that really could be made more robust. I think that really the only point I want to make on this, and we can, subject to the other speakers' agreement, we can make slides available. But I think that the real conclusion that I've seen from both the research in the book and the chapter, but also in our own experience of working across the sports sector, is that we're seeing pockets of good practice. But actually, there is no really one example of robust due diligence that is being undertaken by mega sporting event bodies. We see a lot of reaction, and we see this also in clubs, not just in governing bodies. Reaction to trends, reaction to bad media, and not really a proactive stance of wanting to really consider business and human rights and environmental as a strategic objective for an organization, which we are seeing in other sectors, and particularly with the focus on ESG. So I'm going to stop there. We've got quite a lot of training. If you look on our website, we've got some e-learning, and we'd love anyone who's interested to consider joining us in relation to some of those programs. And if I can just now please hand over to Daniela, and I'm going to ask each of the speakers to introduce themselves. It's far less boring than me doing it. You'd much prefer to hear them say that. So over to you, Daniela.
Sure, thanks, Colleen. Thank you for inviting me to be part of the webinar today. It's a great initiative, and thank you for contributing to our book. I should also say thank you to Andrea and Mustafa, who are all also both in this project. So yeah, I'm really happy to have you participate in this. So my name is Daniela Heert. I work as a consultant for the Center for Sport and Human Rights. I have a background in international public law, human rights, and business and human rights. And I've finished a PhD a short while ago on mega sporting events and human rights. And with the center, I work on their remedy team. So looking at how, when cases of human rights abuses happen in the sporting context, how we can address them and remedy them. And also in the team on academic engagement, so doing the work on education, materials, research activities, like the Routledge handbook, which I'll share a bit more information on later on. Next slide, please. I'm just going to briefly introduce the center, which is a human rights organization for the world of sports. And we work towards a world of sports that fully respects human rights and embeds human rights in its policies and practices through raising awareness, capacity building, and creating lasting value. Next slide, please. As I get to go first for this webinar, or after Colleen, I thought it does make sense to set the scene a little bit by giving examples of what we actually mean when we talk about sports and human rights. So basically the starting point for our work is that sports and human rights have a natural alignment when it comes to, for instance, sports missions and values, which are very closely linked to human rights principles like equality, human dignity, but also in terms of legacy. So sports legacy can contribute to promoting and strengthening human rights, and also certainly under sports integrity, human rights is a key component. And finally, in terms of sports and development and initiatives like Sport for Development and Peace, human rights considerations play a crucial role there as well. And just as a last point, we also have concrete examples of human rights to sport. Actually, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child speaks, for instance, of the right to play and recreational activities. Next slide, please. The reason why we are doing this work is that at the same time, sports can have a negative impact on human rights. And that's true for the day-to-day sports context, but also for sporting events or mega sporting events like the Commonwealth Games, the FIFA World Cups, or the Olympic and Paralympic Games. And some of these negative impacts are listed on these slides. I'm not going to go into detail for all of them, but just want to highlight a few. For instance, cases of discrimination in sports, which can happen in the form of racism, racist comments or chants by fans, but also athletes amongst each other. Discrimination can also happen as a result of eligibility rules by sports bodies that can prevent certain people from participating in their events or competitions, but also in the form of working conditions. For instance, the case of the US women's soccer team is highlighted here, and their fight for equal pay for equal work. Another example is human rights violations related to freedom of expression. So in many ways, sports bodies have regulations in place that can or that are restricting of the freedom of speech of athletes, but also in the context of mega sporting events, this is an issue for communities and fans. And even though you do see some development there of sports bodies trying to adapt these regulations, it's still a big problem. Another problem, which I'm sure many of you have followed, and Mustafa will share more information on, is the issue of those working for staging mega sporting events like the World Cup. And we've all heard the stories of exploitation of migrant workers and the working conditions they're facing on Qatar's construction sites. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, just let's stick to one more example. So I think Something that maybe also is familiar to some of you is the problem of evictions that are happening in the context of staging these events. So here the example that is highlighted is that of people being forcefully evicted in the run-up to the Brazil World Cup and Olympic Games. I will just stop here. I think Mustafa and Andrea will elaborate in detail on some other examples. And I just want to stress that what we know based on excellent work done by NGOs like Equidem and also organizations like the Sports and Rights Alliance is that the issues highlighted here are common issues linked to sport and in some way actually a result of structural issues happening in the world of sports. And next slide, please. So we do our work, or we approach our work with an understanding of the world of sports being an ecosystem of a variety of public, private, national, and international actors and organizations. Again, both in the mega sporting events, but also in the day-to-day sports context. And understanding the dynamics and the dynamic connections between all these actors and the ecosystem actually helps to manage, helps to understand, but also to manage the human rights risks related and also to harness opportunities to then reduce these risks and harms and positively strengthen sports' impact on society. So one thing, for instance, that we just know from taking this perspective on the world of sports is that the power differences that are existing in traditional sporting structures can, for instance, be a factor that increases human rights risks within sports. And presenting the ecosystem in this arena shape actually helps to visualize the intricate web of relationships of all the different actors involved and how they then sit around and surround those affected, which you can find here at the center, which is athletes, but also journalists, workers, coaches, fans, volunteers, communities, and then specific groups related to that. Children and indigenous groups, LGBTQI, women and girls. So they are very much at the center of our focus in our work and also of this ecosystem model and how we approach it. Next slide, please. So like I said, sorry, yeah. Actually, I can run through this because you already explained this, Corinne, but just like I said in the beginning, the center does a lot of capacity building, and this is also where our work on human rights due diligence fits in. And it's based on an understanding of human rights due diligence as this ongoing process and the way it's set out in the UI guiding principles and the OECD guidelines and the 6 steps that are outlined here just resonate with Colleen, what you just presented. So yeah, the basic idea is just if a sports organization or another organization linked to sports follows these steps in its entirety, then sports, day-to-day sports, but also sporting events can actually be a force for good and harness the power that it has to bring people together, promote human rights and strengthen the respect for human rights. Let's go to the next slide then. Please, thank you. So I would just like to close off with some concrete examples of our work on human rights due diligence. And on the slide, you see a number of guides and tools that we actually developed and published to build capacity of different actors within the sports ecosystem to educate them about how to conduct human rights due diligence. And I'm happy to post links to these guides in the chat or share them with Colleen afterwards. But basically, we developed a guide for sports governing bodies on human rights due diligence. We also developed a guide on sponsors, for sponsors, and how to do human rights due diligence in the context of Olympic events or the Olympic Games. Then there's a guide on host actors, so those the governments that are hosting the events and how they should conduct human rights due diligence. And one of our latest publications is actually a due diligence starter kit for national football federations in the specific context of their participation in the World Cup. And we've also hosted a webinar where we actually presented this guide to teach participants about what the human rights due diligence means and how to go through the process. In addition to these guides, we also do rather general educational activities or work where human rights due diligence is part of. The handbook that we publish with Routledge, Colleen, you just mentioned it, features a chapter on human rights due diligence, but it's also a part of other chapters in that book. Then we are currently developing a sport and human rights online course, a 101 course to basically teach the basics of sport and human rights, and human rights due diligence will be part of that. And lastly, we are partnering with the Astor Institute in The Hague for hosting a summer program or summer course on sports and human rights for professionals, which will take place in September this year. And also there, human rights due diligence in the sporting context will come up as part of our day where we talk about governance, but also we have an entire day dedicated to mega sporting events. So there it will also be discussed. And again, I can share the link to that program with you, Colleen, or in the chat. And yeah, that's it from my side. Thanks for listening. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Daniela. So many interesting aspects. And I think if you are able to put some links in the chat, that would be fantastic. So Mustafa, if I can welcome you, I'm so relieved to see that you were able to get the link. And if I hand over to you to introduce yourself, and I can move on to your slides before we'll finish with Andrea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colleen, and apologies for being a little bit late there. As always happens, of course, there was a bit of a perfect storm, so it's great to be here and everything's under control. Firstly, just to say thank you so much to you and Idea for inviting me to speak at this really important event. Very, very timely. And it's also really such a pleasure to share the platform with Daniela and Andrea. You know, the work that both of you and your organizations are doing is so important. And I think one thing that's really coming out already in what Colleen, you and Daniela have said is that this is a multifaceted issue, and it requires many different stakeholders to be involved, many different perspectives, because, you know, certainly in my experience, having worked on human rights for a little over 20 years now, this is a very emerging area. And as much as I'm sure people on this call share the concerns that we all have about the human rights impacts of sport mega events, it's also very exciting. It's an opportunity, and there's an awareness there that we're hopefully all trying to harness for the greater good of everyone that is involved in sport, regardless of in what capacity. So for my part, what I thought would be very useful is to talk a little bit about the work that my organization, Equidem, does that's relevant to the World Cup in Qatar, the Football World Cup that's happening in November and December. My organization, it's a charity that works broadly on human rights and labor rights globally, not just on the issues in Qatar, but obviously that gets a lot of focus. But just to say very briefly that whilst I'm usually based in London, UK, in fact, our teams are all spread in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. And what makes us relatively unique is that most of our research is carried out by rights holders themselves, who are part of our team. And that's a really big part of our philosophy, this idea of being both local and global, and empowering people who are affected by human rights harms or decisions that might impact their human rights, so they understand what human rights is about, that they can be the eyes and ears of the movement, but also we can build towards solutions, not just talking about what those problems are. So that's very much sort of what we're trying to do. And so in very many ways, the work that I will talk about is really the work of others. And with the work that we are doing on the World Cup in Qatar, the research has, I'm very proud to say, been almost entirely done by migrant workers who are part of our team, who are in Qatar itself. So it really has given us really incredible access. Now, obviously, also to stress is that what I say is really a snapshot. It doesn't really refer to all the issues that you might face with regard to migrant workers or others who are in marginalized positions in Qatar, but it is specifically about the first of 3 reports that we're releasing over the next 3 months. We're releasing this particular report tomorrow. It's on the human rights impacts on migrant workers, specifically at the hotels, which are partners of FIFA in Qatar for the World Cup. And so that's what I'll be speaking about. And the report is being released tomorrow, so I won't go too much into all the details of the report, so that we keep a little bit there for you to hopefully join us for that launch tomorrow, and I'll provide the information. But one thing that really came out for me, which you can see in the title in the slide here, is that many of the workers didn't use these exact words, but used words to the effect of, we work like robots. And that really struck me in the research that we did. We did this research over 2 years, not just in the recent time, although our most recent cases are actually from this month, so very, very current. And it started, as you would know, at a time when the world was being gripped by a pandemic. And Qatar, like many other countries, was really struggling with those impacts. So what we really have there is a situation where these hotel workers, who were essentially essential workers, along with being low-wage workers, played critical roles in incredibly difficult situations. And so I'll talk a little bit about that in the next few minutes. If you could just have the next slide, then I'll start off with just a very, very quick summary. And again, this is a really quick summary. So, obviously there's a lot more to say than what's in here, but I thought that it'd be very useful to talk about the background to this setting of Qatar. As Colleen very rightly said, the contact point, the OECD contact point, was actually really critical to, I think, Qatar going down the path of reform. Now, in the human rights community, as you all probably know, the OECD contact points don't generally have the best reputation. So I'm not here to sort of endorse them as some great thing that you can use to get lots of really effective justice. But when the trade union movement brought that complaint, that really started a momentum around asking questions about what's the human rights situation in Qatar. There are issues around gender freedom, issues around sexuality and freedom of expression. But of course, with the majority of its population, an estimated over 2 million people being migrant workers, there were questions about those treatment of those workers. And incredibly, when FIFA chose Qatar and was going through that bidding process, they did not actually require any human rights assessments to be done by anyone that was bidding, not just Qatar. And so that really can be seen in those early days. And so what in this slide we talk about is about the general situation in the Gulf cooperation countries, where that labor arrangements for foreigners is governed by the kafala system. And so what that effectively means is that a private citizen or resident, sometimes a company, is the one that effectively sponsors you and is generally also your employer, and has historically had significant legal and de facto power over your life. Means that in general, they would be able to tell you whether you could change your job, leave the country. If you were to run away from your job, they could actually report you to the authorities to say that you have absconded and that's a crime, even in a situation where you are facing exploitative conditions. And then suddenly the authorities treat you, the victim, as a criminal rather than someone who needs help. And of course, there is no freedom of association rights formally acknowledged in the law. And arguably, it's also criminalized as well. So that when workers peacefully go on strike or seek to do collective action, that there has historically been a very, very harsh response to that. Now, beyond that, you also have a situation that although certain basic labor protections have been recognized under the law in Qatar and other Gulf countries, that yes, there are limitations to that. And yes, there are enforcement issues which are very significant historically. But also certain categories of workers have been excluded from that. And that includes certain types of hotel and services workers, domestic workers, farm workers, that sort of thing. And so, like I said, in that process between 2010 and now, 12 years, which I think for many of us has gone by very, very quickly, we have seen actually quite a significant change in terms of the legislative environment. We've seen moves to remove the power of the employer to basically get the workers permission, the worker has to get permission from their employer to change their job or to leave the country. There has been the creation of a non-discriminatory minimum wage. There have been some improvements in monitoring of payments and attempts to set up a system that would protect worker wages when they don't get paid on time, which is a very, very common issue that workers have. And some resources have also been put in to improve the quality and the speed of the labour justice system, among other things too. One other thing that is not on this list is that there have been in a couple of dozen of enterprises, including World Cup enterprises and hotels that are part of the World Cup, the setup of these things called joint worker committees, which are meant to be between representatives of the employer and the employees to talk about issues around labour conditions and some form of industrial relations. So without going into too much of the reform process in this presentation, is to say that you have that historical situation that I mentioned, but there has been a real movement towards this reform. But critically, these changes, the most significant ones, have happened in the last 3 to 4 years, which when you think about that 12-year cycle is actually very, very recent. And that sort of, I think, is something we can talk about, but again, raises the questions around why so late, and has there been enough time to really have an impact? I think that's a really good, big question. And I think it comes up in the research that we've done. So now if you can move to the next slide, then I'll talk a little bit about our research. And again, I sort of stress, and again, not to be annoying, but I probably am being annoying here, that I won't go too much into the substance of our report, because I'll keep you guys hopefully interested for tomorrow, and it is also embargoed. But to give you an idea that we basically assessed the rights of workers in these FIFA partner hotels, we actually approached over 800 individual migrant workers, but only 80 migrant workers were willing to be interviewed, even though all interviews were done one-to-one, face-to-face mostly, and also completely anonymously and privately. And that really spoke to the fact that workers were very frightened to be speaking about their situation. Now, we did speak to some workers who actually had some very positive things to say about their treatment, and we actually have that in our report as well. And I think that reflects the fact there have been improvements there. But the thing to really stress is that our process and approach was very much one of really trying to get down to the truth, the reality for workers from a bottom-up perspective, meaning that because our team are themselves migrant workers in Qatar, that they can speak to these workers, we understand what they're going through, and then we go upwards from there to understand who is their employer, how they link within the FIFA supply chains. And in fact, the majority of the workers were directly hired by the hotels, which are official partners for the World Cup. And as you can see, of the 80 workers that we've interviewed, many of them were actually outside Qatar, but working for the same hotel chains that are partners with FIFA and Qatar. But of that 80, 54 were actually directly in Qatar itself on these World Cup sites. And we investigated in the end 13 of the 17 FIFA World Cup Qatar hotels. And you can see probably in very small writing there some of the hotel chains that we investigated. I won't go into their names here, but this was a real significant effort on our part, also knowing that there's a really, detailed and in some ways complex architecture of labor compliance monitoring in Qatar. You have the International Labour Organization with a technical office there, some very experienced and very hardworking people doing a good job over there. You have the trade union movement on the ground in Qatar, a relatively unprecedented situation, particularly in the Gulf context, but also globally is quite an unusual situation. And themselves having an estimated 5,000 worker, effectively liaison officers across the worker community. And then, of course, you have FIFA's local partner that is basically responsible for getting the World Cup ready, which is the Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy, which has its own specialist welfare unit and its own worker welfare standards, which are generally speaking a higher threshold under those corporate standards than Qatar's labor law, even after the reforms have happened. And then you have independent consultancies and other experts also helping as well. So there's a really complex architecture there. And it really goes to something I think, Colleen, Daniela, you both said, which is that efforts are being made, but yes, you can still have these problems. And it's this question that I think we can really grapple with today is, why do these problems still persist, even when you have this increased sort of expert-led positive impacts there? So if we could move to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about a few of the other aspects of our report. So our report, this is about recommendations, but before I get into that, our report in very broad terms identified a number of really quite concerning issues. Now, we found that of those 13 hotels that we investigated, that a handful of the women that we interviewed, of the total of 80, complained of sexual harassment in these hotel spaces, particularly the housekeepers. Now, I say handful out of complete transparency, because the reality is that it's extremely difficult to get these workers to talk about those kinds of treatment. Those workers talked about other issues. They talked about, along with other workers who were not women, who were not housekeepers, about unpaid wages, about being charged illegal recruitment fees, which is a forced labor indicator under the ILO's indicators. They often talked about issues around not being able to change their job, about routine harassment. And another issue that was mentioned by workers universally, in fact, was a sense of nationality or gender-based discrimination. And what that typically meant was they felt that because of their gender or their nationality, their pay or their conditions or their upward job prospects within the enterprise were limited or less because they happened to be a woman or they were from a certain African or Asian country or something like that. But beyond that, of course, we had a handful of women talking about either experiencing quite significant serious cases of sexual harassment, or that they had to be effectively protected by colleagues because of the fear of it. And it's something that really comes out in quite a chilling way in the testimonies that our team very skillfully and very carefully, thoughtfully spoke to these workers about. That you had situations where workers would have to literally not be left on their own while doing their housekeeping duties, or in other situations when they would tell their management, and to the credit of their immediate management, they would try to respond to it. But the remedy that they would provide was to effectively replace them with male workers or to put them on a different floor, rather than addressing the issues underlying it. Now, the harassment that the workers that did speak to us very bravely about was about guests who were staying at the hotel. And that's something I think that, I think we'd all agree we should put a chill down our spine. Because obviously we have in the World Cup thousands and thousands of people coming. And yes, some really good work has been done around training of the hotel enterprises and their staff, their management and others. But of course, that's very different to the people who are visiting the country. And that the reality is in these kind of sporting events, you've got revelers, a high proportion of people from certain demographics who are more likely to be, coming from situations where they're, that it puts workers at risks because of those demographics. It's something that cannot be addressed simply by having robust standards or having training sessions to management. It's something that requires worker representation approaches, bottom-up approaches to really address that. And so, again, very happy to expand on that in the rest of the discussion, but to really very quickly end is, in terms of our recommendations, they're more detailed than obviously we say in the report. Sorry, if I could just get back to the previous slide, just very quickly. Sorry about that, Colleen. Is that, we talk about FIFA really making all efforts to require partner hotels to demonstrate compliance with international labour standards, of course, including occupational safety and health, and responsible downsizing rules. The downsizing rules, because we started our research during the pandemic when worker levels were reduced, but also, of course, that worker levels are very likely to reduce just before and after the World Cup tournament. And our research indicates that there is a real practice of not paying workers their last dues or other kinds of exploitation in that process of very quickly demobilizing them. And then, of course, developing regionally informed and sector-specific approaches to labour and human rights. And so what we mean by that is, because the hotel sector, whilst the Gulf is a very rich and complex, social situation, you have often about 10 or 15 hotel chains that are in all of these countries. In fact, the way that they manage their presence is in the region is a common approach. And these Gulf states do have many of the same issues across the country. And so there has to be a regional approach to do that. With Qatar, we said that it's very important that they actually continue the pursuit of international minimum standards, that they don't see that the current reforms, which we feel are positives, are themselves the destination, that they are part of that journey. But also critically, that only the establishment of a genuinely independent migrant workers centre a space where workers can feel safe to talk to other workers about what they're facing, and so that other workers on their behalf can make representations. That sadly, Qatar's ambitious reform agenda will not reach the points it needs to really ensure it respects the rights of the over 2 million people, migrant workers who call Qatar home. So that was the main things about the recommendation. We talk a little bit about what teams and spectators do around due diligence. And I also want to just to emphasize as I end that we really see what we're doing as complementing the work that the other colleagues on this call and other organizations that are working on this are doing. It's one of those things where I know some will say, look, who do we trust? Who do we go to? Who has the right guidance? There's so many different people with different bits of findings and recommendations coming out. But in fact, if you look through the material, which, in my experience is very user-friendly, there are some really common themes that come out. And the world is watching. I know it sounds like a real cliche, but the world is watching. And, my final message really is to the Qataris and FIFA and their partners. And that is to say that, the reality is the reputation built in this World Cup overall, despite the positives that are there, is still very negative. But there are a few months left before the World Cup starts. So the time is now to really address these things so that we can actually enjoy the World Cup with a clear conscience. But the reality, as our research has shown, is many issues are still there. I'll leave it there. My contact details are also on the slide, and I'll also put in the chat details for the launch tomorrow. But again, thank you so much, Pauline and others, for inviting me to speak today. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. That was so insightful. I've penned down so many questions, and I doubt we're going to get to them because I really want to give Andrea a chance now to bring in her insights. And I fear that we probably won't have a lot of time for questions and answers. Maybe this would mean we can loop back perhaps next year and see where we are and rethinking where everything goes with the World Cup 2026 and perhaps also to think a little bit more broadly than just football. There are so many other sporting associations, and I think, Andrea, actually you might be reflecting on that now. So shall I just hand over to you and welcome?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Colleen. Thanks for inviting the Sport and Rights Alliance to join this really important conversation. It's also really a pleasure to be here with Daniela and Mustafa. So just briefly, I'm a Brazilian human rights lawyer, campaigner, and firm believer of collective action and movement building. I've been working on sports and human rights for the past 10 years. So before Brazil hosted the World Cup and seeing really closely what happened here to our communities in Brazil in general, also during the Olympics. And it was around that time when the Sport and Rights Alliance actually came together. So please, next slide. So the Sport and Rights Alliance really is an alliance of civil society and trade union organizations that saw the power that sports has, not only to advance human rights, but to unite people in it and have empathy for each other and around subjects that they care. So not only sports governing bodies and everyone around sports actually have the responsibility, like Daniela rightly mentioned, under the UN guiding principles to respect human rights. But it's also important to notice that there's an important role for sports to advance human rights. So when we see around the world authoritarian regimes and our rights actually going backwards, sports has this potential to help us advance and help us come together under one roof and one stadium, right? To look at each other with empathy and solidarity. And that's where really the Sport and Rights Alliance thrives, right? So next slide, please. So by bringing together player, fans, survivor groups, journalists, the LGBTI community, the Sport and Rights Alliance was founded in 2015 and is united on our vision to raise the bar for sport, human rights, and transparency. Next slide. So we are a global coalition of many civil society and trade unions, some of those that are really famous and known to a lot of people, like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, the International Trade Union Confederation. But we also are joined by Football Supporters Europe, really an important constituency when it comes to sports. We also happily have the Army of Survivors, who represent really survivors groups that came together to not only advocate for the end of the endemic sexual abuse that happens in sports, but it also highlights more broadly how our society still has a lot to advance when it comes to ending the culture of harassment that we live in. So next slide, please. So our work on children specifically is a critical element to our struggle. And that's where I think, as Mustafa was mentioning, that's where we see whether those actions around due diligence and around risk assessments are actually working or not, right? Because it's a critical subject. It's a place where it's really hard to report. You really have to have the right systems in place to make people feel safe and trust on what they're saying is actually going to be taken into account and actioned. So it really shows the urgency of an effective due diligence system and efforts. Another point is that if sports governing bodies actually fail to deliver on the promises that they have made and the promises of equality and dignity, these can have really devastating impact on survivors, right? The only thing worse than not having a system to report is having a system that fails survivors, because it can also potentially re-traumatize them and further cause harm. Next slide, please. So today I just wanted to bring to light one specific case that actually is marking its 1-year anniversary this week. We have a year ago, together with Human Rights Watch, reported on the systemic abuse of under-19 basketball players in Mali. These reports found overwhelming evidence of sexual harassment and assault during decades. And FIBA, the International Basketball Players Federation, commissioned an independent investigation and announced recently the establishment of a safeguarding council. According to their website, this council is an advisory board on matters related to safeguarding and protection of vulnerable groups. But what do these steps that look really good on paper meant for the survivors and the whistleblowers and their families in Mali? Well, actually, the independent investigation meant that 22 survivors were intimidated, either by Basketball Federation officials or other governmental officials. It meant also that a year later, they have received no support, no accountability, no justice, no recognition of what they've suffered, and they have not been able to come back to the sports that they love. So in addition to having no support, no reconciliation, no remedy or compensation, it is really important to mention that they were harassed and abused during a sport that they love. So they would love to go back to playing basketball. They would love to continue doing what they love, but this has completely been missed from any of this shiny investigations and safeguarding councils and bodies created. So actually on the ground, we've seen a backlash, right? Instead of going forward, what we saw was survivors intimidated, whistleblowers intimidated, And many others that didn't come forward, the message that they get is that they shouldn't, right? Because if you do, you're going to be put more at risk. Nothing really is going to happen to your case, and the governance systems will continue the same. So we have, for far too long witnessed the failed and re-traumatizing processes that survivors have to go through to report their grievances. The testimonies of courageous survivors and whistleblowers around the world confirm that there is systemic abuse and harassment and sextortion, as Transparency International Germany recently launched a report on that. And it continues to be a dreadful reality. We don't need to hear more cases about abuse. We just need to simply take a trauma-informed approach, put survivors at the center, and listen to them. So part of sports governing bodies' responsibility is really to hear, understand, in order to respond. And next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight an important point in all of this process, which is stakeholder engagement. So really the ability to listen. When you recognize that you're part of the human rights community, that you have responsibilities and also can enact to advance human rights, it means that you have to listen to people. We can't afford for the next generation of athletes to experience abuse. And stakeholder engagement actually means not only informing or consulting with civil society, but actually collaborating, coming together, brainstorming together the solutions, coming together and in agreement with each other. In the months to come, I think we're seeing many developments around policy, around councils being set up, but what we really want is actual change, and that means having remedy for survivors, protecting survivors, and ensuring that they can go back to the sports that they love. Happy to expand a little bit in the next minutes around the types of remedy and how we've seen the remedy framework, which is, a really important pillar of the UN guiding principles, but that has been overlooked so far by sports governing bodies and others involved around sports. Thank you.
Andrea, thank you so much. Sorry, I was getting slightly distracted trying to put all the links into the chat session. So there are links that are going in there now. But actually, I do thank you so much to all of you. I just think that the depth of your analysis and your insights, I'm sure for those who are listening, will be hugely appreciated. And I think, taking away from what I've been listening to with all of you, I think the fact that each of you have come to this with this different perspective really does show how many actors there are involved in sport, how multifaceted these issues are, talking about the athletes, the workers who are supporting the opportunities for hosting the sporting events, the governing bodies, and then when I look at it from our perspective, working with clubs or, those organizations on the ground who often also have to change their own working practices to fit in with rules like UEFA and FIFA. And we don't often talk about that, but that can sometimes have an incredibly negative impact on a particular organization where they might have much higher standards than the ones that are being set for them, but they have to they have to almost regress to be able to align what they're doing with the standards. We have 4 minutes, and I just want to see if there are any particular questions. But maybe while I look them up, I wonder, Andrea, if you would like to just talk a little bit more around, effective remedy. I didn't really go into detail. I mean, one of the things we've certainly seen is that remedy is very immature, but I don't necessarily think that's just the sports sector. I think that's across the board. It's one of, was it you that said it's one of the lost pillars almost of the UN guiding principles? But I wonder if you just want to talk a little bit more about that, and particularly because you've got the insights around survivors and what are their own redress in situations. And I'm sure Mustafa, Daniela, you might want to add in on that. I'll hand over to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Colleen. I think this is really an important topic, and it is really the challenge that we're currently facing as we see, many sports governing bodies adopt human rights, embed human rights within their policies and governance. We're not seeing this translate to the reality of the people impacted. So I think in the challenge of the remedy discussion is that we have to move from the discussion around processes to outcomes. Efforts matter, and remedy is urgent. So instead of talking about whether the sports governing body has contributed or has a link to the specific violation, we should talk about enabling remedy. So what can any sports governing bodies do to leverage its influence, power, and structures to enable remedy and enable solutions, accepting that you have a role, not only because you have the responsibility, but also because of the change you want to see happen in the world, right? Because of the values that you portray. So instead of talking about liability, precedent, or direct contribution, we should talk about enabling remedy. We should talk about how sports governing bodies have to do the right thing and to represent the athletes that are playing the games that they love and are part of this sports communities. They have to enable justice, right? The most severe impacts by sports are not causation or harm. So we shouldn't be looking for direct links, but we should be looking for the values and how sports can play a role to enable athletes to achieve justice, remedy, and actually go back to playing the sports that they love so much.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. I like that point around enabling. I think that's really interesting because I think that that in itself allows perhaps more buy-in to something than it just being prescriptive. But Mustafa and Daniela, would you like to add something to the point about remedy? We'll start with you, Mustafa, maybe.
Sure, Colleen. Really just to echo what Andrea says, I think you really hit the nail on the head there, which is that it has to be also about seeing from the perspective of those that are most at risk of harm. And we often see this very sort of corporate compliance approach of, well, do we contractually have a link to the person or that sort of a thing? But the reality is that if you actually take a different approach, turn things around, think from the bottom up, then what are the risks those people are facing, then you can actually start working out very quickly where there is the need for an intervention. And to use the Qatar example, though it's not unique to Qatar, but in the Qatar example, you have certain situations which are inherently there because it is a society with very little political freedom, where there's no, surprises as to the human rights challenges there. And therefore, you cannot expect to address these problems if you take an approach where you have lots of experts and lots of things that are done that have positives, but don't actually go to the structural obstacles in your way. I think in the situation in Qatar, although it doesn't have to be migrant workers you look at, when you have migrant workers so deeply affected by what's happening, whether they're women or they're men, and particularly looking in our case for the hotels with our report, it's a no-brainer that you can't simply have, as good as they are, I'm very familiar with them, grievance mechanisms, training processes, auditing, and all that sort of thing. They need to have a space. People who are at risk have to have a space where they can express themselves, where they can report issues. And again, it is about what we really love. It's about sport and humanity. It's about, as Andrea just said so eloquently, we want to celebrate that. So let's try to get that right. Let's not have from the sporting community and their corporate partners this very, very reactive and defensive approach, but we actually share the same values. So let's work in that respect.
Yeah, thank you. We don't have time today, but I would have loved to have had a separate conversation around corporate partners and sponsorships. I mean, something we spoke about 10 years ago when I was doing a lot more work around sustainability in sport was actually, where was that conversation? And perhaps if that's starting now, that would be great to hear more about it. But we'll have to have that for another day. Daniela, would you like to add anything on the remedy point before we close off?
Yeah, I'll just be very brief, and it actually connects nicely to what you just said, Colleen. I think one thing that we observe in our work is that there are certain mechanisms or processes where sports can really learn from if we look at this broader business and human rights field. And I mean, many of these businesses that have adopted grievance mechanisms or have rather good mechanisms in place, they are also sponsors for sports in different kind of capacities. So I think there's a lot of room for sharing lessons and learning more from each other and looking outside of the sporting world to then learn from how businesses have approached this. But yeah, I think that still doesn't happen enough. And that's also why we see that for many of the issues in sports, there is simply no mechanism available to address it. And where mechanisms are available, then it's often the problem that they lack human rights capacity because they haven't been designed for dealing with these kind of cases in the first place. So I think the realization is a bit that it's not necessary to reinvent the wheel in some ways and for some of the issues at stake. But where mechanisms are already there that could then, be expanded and built upon, they really need to be redesigned or reformed with a human rights lens.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's so helpful. I honestly would love to keep talking to you both, all the three of you, not two of you, for the rest of the day. But we need to draw to a close. I just want to thank everybody for participating today, coming to listen to our speakers, Andrea, Daniela, Mustafa. Thank you for your time and the effort you've put into your discussion with us today. It's really insightful. I look forward to the report tomorrow, Mustafa. I don't know that I can join. I'll be traveling to Nottingham, but I will certainly be looking out for it in my inbox. And so thank you, and wishing you all well and a happy summer if you're still due to take your holidays. So thank you, everybody. God bless.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.